diplomatic issues that have a section of wartime history. But Tanaka welcomed the inclusion of an appeal to share the experiences of those affected by nuclear weapons. He said the new wording in the draft can be understood to cover areas beyond the two cities, such as where nuclear bomb tests were conducted. He said the important thing is to abolish nuclear weapons, and added that he would like nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers to resolve their differences and reach a final agreement.
The Japanese government has decided on a new basic policy for the disposal of highly radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. The policy, revised for the first time in 7 years, was approved at a cabinet meeting on Friday. The government plans to bury high-level radioactive waste from nuclear plants at a depth of 300 meters or more in final disposal facilities. But the efforts to solicit candidate sites have made no progress in the past 13 years due to strong safety concerns. The new basic policy says the government will name suitable candidate sites for the final disposal facilities and will seek the cooperation of the relevant local authorities. In an attempt to dispel public misgivings, the policy stipulates that the waste could be retrieved even after final disposal in the event of a change in government policy or other circumstances. The relevant ministers have confirmed that the government will work to win the understanding of the public and local governments for the policy. Economy, Trade, and Industry Minister Yoichi Miyazawa told reporters after the cabinet meeting that the government will proceed steadily, starting with efforts to win the understanding of the public and local authorities for the candidate sites.
You're listening to NHK World Radio Japan from Tokyo. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says Japan will work with the Asian Development Bank to invest $110 billion over 5 years to meet Asia's huge demand for infrastructure. Abe addressed a gathering of political and business leaders from Asian nations in Tokyo on Thursday. Referring to infrastructure finance in the region, Abe said, until now, state governments have been asked to guarantee somewhat excessive payments for short-term risk. He stressed Japan will challenge that practice. The Prime Minister said Japan's government aims to spread high-quality and innovative infrastructure throughout Asia, taking a long-term view. Abe also said Asia has a voracious demand for infrastructure reaching as much as 100 trillion yen, or $825 billion annually. He said Asia should seek quality as well as quantity in investment projects. He said pursuing both ambitiously is perfectly suited to Asia. Observers say Abe's speech is meant to stress he will promote quality infrastructure investment to further contribute to Asia's sustained development.
Friday marks the first anniversary of a military coup in Thailand, but the road to civilian rule remains unclear. The military claimed the coup was to resolve the political standoff that had deepened since massive demonstrations erupted against the administration of then Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. Last month, the coup leader and interim Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha lifted martial law, which had been in place for about 10 months. But his government still maintains tough measures against its critics, such as a ban on gatherings of 5 or more people. The government is particularly hard on supporters of Yingluck and her older brother and former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. But the approach is causing a persistent backlash, raising concern that another political battle may occur. A draft for a new constitution includes a provision that would allow an unelected person to become Prime Minister. Critics say it will weaken party politics. Calls are growing for a national referendum on the draft. The public atmosphere is expected to force the government to postpone parliamentary elections from this year to the next.
The U.S. Defense Department has shown a video in which China warns a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft operating in the South China Sea. The footage released on Thursday was taken by a U.S. Navy P-8 reconnaissance plane that operates from the Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. The video shows China's construction of an airstrip on reclaimed land around reefs in the Spratly Islands. China is involved in a sovereignty dispute over these islands with several parties. The video also shows transcriptions of radio transmissions in which the Chinese Navy told the aircraft it was approaching China's military zone and asked it to leave the area immediately. The aircraft responded that it was operating in international airspace according to international law. Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell told a news conference on Thursday that the flight of a U.S. reconnaissance plane in international airspace over the South China Sea is a regular and appropriate occurrence. He said the U.S. will seek to preserve the ability of all countries to exercise their right to freedom of navigation.
The United States and Cuba began their fourth round of talks on normalizing diplomatic relations on Thursday and agreed to continue the negotiations on Friday. The negotiations began in Washington between U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson and the chief of the Cuban Foreign Ministry's U.S. Division, Josefina Vidal. Agenda items included restoring diplomatic ties and reopening embassies in the two nations' capitals. Details of the talks are not known. As preconditions for reopening the embassies, the U.S. appears to have demanded that Cuba lift its restrictions on U.S. diplomats traveling throughout Cuba and allow Cuban nationals to visit the U.S. Embassy after it opens. The U.S. State Department issued a statement after the talks saying that negotiations would continue on Friday. Attention is focused on whether the two sides can reach an agreement during the current round of talks.
British Prime Minister David Cameron says he plans to negotiate with the European Union on restricting access to the UK welfare system for migrants from other EU countries. Cameron announced the plan on Thursday. He said he wants to ensure that Britain's welfare benefits are not a driver of the EU's freedom of movement rules. He indicated the need to restrict welfare payments, including jobless and childcare benefits. Data released on Thursday show that net migration to Britain from other EU member states hit a record high of more than 260,000 last year. A surge in the number of EU migrants was a key issue in the general election earlier this month. Cameron pledged during the campaign that he would negotiate the issue with the EU. The Prime Minister said changes to welfare to cut EU migration will be an absolute requirement in his negotiations with the EU. Cameron plans to hold a referendum by the end of 2017 on whether Britain should leave the EU in the face of growing public discontent with the influx of immigrants.
The Sendai nuclear power plant in southwestern Japan is likely to move one step closer to restart. Japan's nuclear regulator will approve the designs of all the newly installed facilities for its #1 reactor as early as Friday. Operator Kyushu Electric Power Company has been slow in submitting some of the design documents to regulators. They include the designs of the facilities shared with the #2 reactor, such as the control room's air conditioning. The regulator says it has finally confirmed the quake resistance for these designs and that all the designs for safety purposes will be approved. The next step is an in-person inspection by officials that leads to the reactor's restart. The regulator has been conducting inspections since March, but it has completed less than 10% of more than 200 inspection items as of Sunday. This will set the restart date of the #1 reactor to late July at the earliest. The operator says it plans to restart the plant's #2 reactor in August or shortly afterward.
Japan's Emperor and Empress invited the leaders of Pacific Island nations to the Imperial Palace on Thursday ahead of the opening of the Pacific Island Leaders Meeting. Japanese and Pacific Island leaders meet every 3 years in Japan to discuss environmental issues and other topics. This year's meeting is being held on Friday and Saturday in Iwaki City, Fukushima Prefecture, northeastern Japan. Leaders from the 13 participating countries and international organizations attended a tea party hosted by Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko on Thursday afternoon. The guests included President Tommy Remengesau of Palau, which is co-hosting the summit with Japan. Crown Prince Naruhito also took part. The Emperor and Empress spent about half an hour enjoying conversations with the guests.
Finally, another look at the top stories at this hour. The Islamic State militant group is reportedly building a stronghold at ancient ruins in the suburbs of the central Syrian city of Palmyra. And delegates to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference are divided over the contents of a draft document summarizing the outcome ahead of the closing day session. And that was the news from NHK World Radio Japan in Tokyo. I'm Maxwell Powers.
And I'm Eriko Kojima.
Next we have Radio Japan Focus. Please stay tuned. This is NHK World Radio Japan.